Hello and welcome once again to another exciting episode of Born Psyched. In this episode we will continue to examine the topic of attachment, but this time we will focus on the first of two specific theories of attachment, that of the learning theory. As I stated earlier, we will be examining the learning theory of attachment. This is an extension of the behavioural approach that you would cover in Paper 2. And makes use of the concepts of classical and operant conditioning, originally tested by Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner respectively. The learning theory of attachment stems from the assumptions of the behavioural approach of the early 1900s, in that all behaviour, including that of attachment, is learned via experience. Since Wilhelm Wundt introduced the concept of introspection, psychologists have strived to find a way of studying human behaviour more scientifically. The behavioural approach attempts to observe physical behaviours without being concerned about internal mental processes. The learning theory of attachment specifically focuses on the behaviours seen in interactions between parent and child. Just a quick disclaimer though, guys. When you are talking about the learning theory of attachment, don't get too caught up in describing the behavioural approach in general, as it won't necessarily apply. You must link it to attachment. When it comes to classical conditioning, it is best to remind yourselves of Pavlov's experiment with salivating dogs. However, the details of that study are somewhat less relevant than the process of association that Pavlov described. According to the learning theory of attachment, the process starts with a simple response. Namely, the child gains pleasure from feeding. The food acts as an unconditioned stimulus, and the pleasure is an unconditioned response. The food will always be paired with a feeder. In this case, it's usually the mother. Now, the mother acts as a neutral stimulus, while still resulting in a pleasured response from the feeding. Over time, the child learns to associate the parent with the pleasure they would get from feeding, and thus an attachment is formed. What we see here is the mother then becomes what we call a conditioned stimulus, and the pleasure then is a conditioned response. Now, in terms of operant conditioning, you need to be reminded of B.F. Skinner's famous research using rats, what we like to know as the Skinner box. Like with Pavlov though, it's not so much that study you need to worry about, but more about this whole process of reinforcement. Now, the work into attachment was put forward by Dollard and Miller, and they came up with this idea that very closely resembles that of classical conditioning, but is based around the principles of reinforcement. Now, they suggested that operant conditioning is very closely linked to the concept of drive reduction. Now, drives in terms of human behaviour are that which motivate us, i.e. we are driven to do something. When a child is uncomfortable for whatever reason, whether it's due to hunger or other factors like lack of comfort, they want some attention, etc., they are motivated or driven to reduce that. Now, what they find is that when they are fed, this helps to reduce this comfort, and the food becomes what we call a primary reinforcer, because it reduces these negative feelings the child has. The person providing food, which, let's be honest, 19 times out of 20 tends to be the mother, becomes a secondary reinforcer because she is also paired with it. Notice how I said this is very similar to classical conditioning because there's still this idea of pairing two stimuli. The child will then seek out the person who provides the food. This is where we see this attachment being formed. The interesting fact is that at the moment we are only talking about attachment from a child's point of view. We need to understand about attachment also from a parent's point of view. And this is where we understand the concept that attachment is actually reciprocal, i.e. it goes both ways. Now, what this means is that a parent is also driven to reduce these negative stimuli. Now, from a parent's point of view, that negative stimuli is hearing a child in distress, like through crying. Now, that could be for several reasons. Now, according to evolutionary psychologists, parents are naturally inclined to dislike the sound of a child crying, and therefore are motivated to do what they can to eliminate that. So by going over to a crying child, giving it attention, food, etc., the child would therefore stop crying, which is a state that the parent finds desirable. Thus, they are reinforcing the behavior of going and giving the child attention. Now, in terms of operant conditioning terminology, if you think they are doing something to take away a negative stimulus, which as we know is negative reinforcement. One thing I will say though, guys, is so far I've mentioned two key studies, that of Pavlov's dogs and the Skinner box. It is really, really important that you don't get caught up in describing these two studies. Neither of them have any direct link to attachment. They only talk about it in terms of the process. The actual procedure and findings of those studies have absolutely no relevance for the topic of attachment. So don't use them unless you can directly link them into attachment. Now, in addition to operant and classical conditioning, we also have this concept of social learning theory. However, with social learning theory, I would be more inclined to use it as evaluation as opposed to description. There is a very good reason for this. The fact that social learning theory, because it was a much later theory, you could almost consider it an alternative replacement for the original concepts identified in the behavioral approach. For those of you who are not familiar with social learning theory, it is based upon the work of Albert Bandura. You may even remember his most famous experiment, which we know as the Bobo doll experiment. Now, this is very closely linked to this concept of interactional synchrony that I described a few videos ago. The idea that a child will see something and then will try to imitate it. This could be used, according to Hay and Bespo, to explain how children form attachments. The idea is the child will observe their parents' behavior, usually this affection towards them, and want to reciprocate this back. So the child will imitate this behavior, and thus you see this affectionate behavior going to and fro from the child to the parent. Now, the parents would also instruct their child on how to behave in relationships and reward them accordingly. So there are elements of operant conditioning within this as well. So from this, the child will learn to understand what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, due to rewards and imitation. Some further evaluation points though. This is something you may want to consider should you need to write an essay or just evaluate in general. First of all, because we are talking about behavioral concepts, we must take into account that these are highly reductionist. They focus too much on basic stimulus response scenarios and ignore so many other factors that can contribute to the development of attachments. When you think about social learning theory, the reason why I say it's often used as an evaluation is the fact that it does take into account cognitions and internal processes. In previous videos, we've talked about a number of studies. Things like the Schaefer and Emerson study, when we talked about stages, or the Lorenz and Harlow studies, when we were looking at animal research. All of these can be used as critical studies, i.e. they would disagree with the learning theory. Now, the reason being is the learning theory assumes that the major reinforcer for all attachment behavior is food. The problem with that is most of the studies identify that food actually has very little impact on attachment. It's more to do with this concept of comfort. Right, just finally then, quick exam hint. Now I've mentioned this already. If you are going to answer an essay question on the learning theory, you must link your answer directly to attachment. If you don't, then you're often failing to gain marks for your knowledge and understanding of the theory. As it says there, generic explanations of classical and operant conditioning will not gain you any credit. So make sure that when you are talking about them, that you do link them to attachment. And this whole concept of elaboration. If you don't elaborate fully, then you are not going to be able to get into the top mark band.
Okay, it's exam question time. I have had a specific request from some of my current AS psychology students to go through how to effectively answer a 12-mark question on the learning theory. So here goes. First of all, in the exam you are likely to encounter a planning box such as this. I would advise any student to briefly scan through their exam paper to identify questions like this and make use of this space. The first thing I would do is divide this box equally in two. Then I would label each half AO1 for your description and AO3 for your evaluation. It would then be a good idea to briefly summarize the AO1 content, usually in the form of bullet points. I would start off with classical conditioning, talk about what needs to be said in that. Then move on to operant conditioning, looking at drive reduction and reinforcement, and then finishing off with the fact that attachment is reciprocal and how the parent will also attach to the child. When it comes to evaluation, try to keep it fairly balanced between strengths and weaknesses. You could consider points such as the fact that learning theory is quite reductionist. It's also a really good idea to consider all the critical or counter evidence. Some of the best ones are listed there. You could also look at alternative theories or explanations, such as social learning theory and how it was used to replace most traditional learning theories. Now, at the same time, you do also need to consider the fact that it is naive to assume that learning theory has had little to no impact on the development of attachments. As explained in my previous videos though, if you want top marks, you must make sure your AO3 points are both detailed and effective. Specifically, you have linked your points back to the topic in the question.
Okay guys, I hope you found this video useful. If you have, please feel free to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you want to be notified of any future videos coming out, please make sure you do click that subscribe button. And also, please leave comments because I always want to know about how to improve these videos for people. Alright, that's all for now. Take care now. Bye.